Korea, 1950. Under American leadership, the United Nations went to war for the first time. What began as a conflict between rival regimes, North and South, turned into a confrontation between East and West, threatening to escalate into a Third World War. The Allied forces became embroiled in a war unlike any they'd known. Yet for the Americans, it served as a military rehearsal for one they would come to know only too well in Vietnam. This was a war of sharp contrasts, like the harsh Korean terrain itself, ranging from freezing mountains in winter to parched valleys in summer. It started in rapid advances and retreats, and it ended in trench warfare and continuous bombardment, reminiscent of the First World War. The UN forces relied on superior weaponry to limit their losses, pounding the lightly armed communist soldiers who sacrificed thousands attacking in human waves. Experts believed that the sheer volume of UN air power would win the war. The latest jets added their weight to the range of Second World War planes, using rockets, bombs and napalm in support of their ground forces. Yet even the massive American bombing campaign that systematically pulverized northern cities was instrumental only in grinding the war to its final bitter stalemate, devastating the country in the process. It was a war which nobody won, but the losers could be seen everywhere. A sea of refugees constantly set adrift by the changing tide of battle. 3 million Korean civilians are estimated to have died in 3 years of war. Korea was no stranger to war. Common borders with China, Russia, and proximity to Japan had made it the focus of 3 wars in 60 years, ending in its forcible colonization by Japan in 1910. Yet it was the Allied decision of 1945, splitting the country along the 38th parallel, with Russia and America each occupying half, that led to the Korean War, and has left it today with rival governments in Pyongyang and Seoul, holding sway over 2 very different Korean societies. The Soviet Union declared war on the Japanese armies occupying Manchuria and Korea in August that year. In a swift campaign, they crushed Japanese dreams of an alternative empire. The surrender of their colonial masters brought fresh hope of independence for Koreans. And they greeted the Russians as liberators as they marched south, opening the whole country to them. The Russians halted at an arbitrary line on the map in response to a last-minute American proposal, even though the first Americans didn't arrive in Korea until the end of September. Initial encounters between the 2 armies at the 38th parallel were friendly, but the chill of the Cold War soon reached Korea. When a UN commission was set up to oversee reunification in 1948, the Russians refused to acknowledge its power in the north. Elections went ahead in the south alone, resulting in a government recognized by the United Nations. Its president was Syngman Rhee, a Korean nationalist who'd opposed the Japanese occupation and spent years in exile in the United States. He declared the new Republic of Korea from Seoul. In Pyongyang, the Russians backed Kim Il-sung, a communist guerrilla leader who'd made his name fighting the Japanese. He proclaimed the Democratic People's Republic of Korea the same year. Both governments enlisted armies to support their claim to the whole country. When the Russians withdrew in 1948, they left Kim Il-sung with a well-trained force. American advisors stayed on to train the Southern Army when their own troops pulled out the following year. Sporadic fighting between the 2 regimes turned into pitched battle on the 25th of June 1950. Both sides claimed the other attacked first, but within hours the northern forces, spearheaded by their 230 Russian tanks, had broken through into southern territory. The United Nations Security Council identified the North as the aggressor. The absence of the Russian delegate boycotting in support of Communist China's claim to a seat left the Americans a clear field, refugees choking the road south. Into this chaos came the first US troops, 400 infantrymen known as Task Force Smith. Their orders were to join South Korean soldiers awaiting the northern advance. They took position on the 4th of July. Next morning, a column of T-34 tanks backed by infantry drove at them. With no sign of the promised South Korean support, they attempted to halt the northern columns alone. It was a disaster. The tanks went straight through. Their outdated bazookas simply bounced off the armor, and their artillery had the wrong ammunition. For many, the fighting was over, but the suffering had just begun. Their fate was soon shared by other Americans, thrust too hastily into the line. In the following weeks, the South Korean and US forces suffered a string of defeats, falling back to the southeast around the main supply port of Busan. In danger of being driven out of Korea altogether, the UN command built a defensive line along the Nakhtong River. General Walton Walker deployed the US 8th Army along its eastern bank. With the bridges blown, this offered some protection along part of the 130-mile perimeter he'd drawn around Busan. Troops and equipment from all over the world poured into the port. Though it didn't seem like it, the UN forces actually outnumbered the North Koreans by the middle of August. For 6 weeks, the UN conducted a stubborn defense of the perimeter. Fighting from prepared positions with artillery support and air cover, they acquitted themselves better than they had in the opening weeks. But the North Koreans showed no signs of flagging. They launched repeated attacks across fordable sections of the Nakhtong, and General Walker kept some of his best troops in reserve to meet any potential breakthrough. When a North Korean attack succeeded in penetrating the perimeter early in August, he called on the 1st Marine Provisional Brigade to counterattack. On arrival in Korea, these elite troops had learnt of the string of early defeats. Stories of open panic and desertion only added to America's humiliation. But the Marines had their own way of doing things and fought by their own codes. Virtually self-contained with their own armor, artillery and air corps, they were a highly disciplined and effective fighting force. Many who fought with them in Korea were critical of their habit of attacking head-on, no matter what opposition they faced, regarding it as brave but reckless. And it was reflected in the high proportion of casualties they suffered. As one witness commented, they went up in columns of companies, and they came back in platoons of stretchers. Yet even here, resistance was remarkably light. Within 2 hours, they'd flushed the few defenders from their bunkers and swept the island. The main force waited at sea for an agonizing 9 hours, coming into land on the next high tide, while the Marines kept the defenders pinned down. Again, there was little opposition, and they quickly established a beachhead. MacArthur's gamble had paid off handsomely, at a cost of only 20 dead. Ten Corps' commander had promised MacArthur he would take Seoul by September the 25th, and he pushed his men on at speed. Belatedly, the North Koreans fought back. They still had 20,000 soldiers around Seoul, and they fought all the way back into the city itself. Then from street to street, and finally from a succession of barricades along the main boulevard. Official notice of Seoul's capture went out on the 25th as planned. Though there were 2 more days of hard fighting before the North Koreans were driven from the city, and by then much of it had been reduced to rubble. Mass graves revealed that their brief tenure of South Korea had been a savage affair for those they saw as opponents. Yet as power passed back to the South Koreans, many UN soldiers were equally shocked by the roundup of suspected collaborators who were forced to wear the traditional mask of the criminal before being marched off to an unknown fate. But the official tone was one of celebration.
General MacArthur makes a personal visit to Seoul, where he returns the government of the Republic to President Syngman Rhee. With tears in his eyes, the Supreme Commander completes his first assignment under the United Nations banner.
The day after the Incheon landings, the 8th Army began pushing northwards to link up with Ten Corps. It took 3 days of hard fighting to cross the Naktong River. Then the pace quickened as the North Korean line broke. Isolated groups retreated into the mountains to wage guerrilla war. But short of supplies, they could do little against the weight of the 8th Army. The UN had learnt from its early experience and now possessed 500 medium tanks to lead the advance along the narrow roads. And close air support quickened the pace. During the debacle of July, the lack of coordination had squandered UN air superiority. Now they made it tell. Napalm became a preferred weapon in Korea. Though militarily effective, its widespread use had horrific consequences for civilians. The carrier-launched prop planes were now joined by Navy jets. The F-9 Panther was the first of the new breed to see combat. From their floating airfields, they could always keep the fluid front line within range, carrying their enhanced firepower anywhere over the Korean mainland. By the end of September, the surviving North Koreans had fled back across the parallel, or been rounded up as the UN forces cut their retreat. With South Korea nominally under his control, Syngman Rhee seized the initiative. On the 1st of October, he ordered his own troops across the 38th parallel, in pursuit not only of the northern forces, but of his own dream of a reunited Korea. A week later, the UN forces followed them. Hours after they crossed, a UN resolution ordered that all appropriate steps be taken to ensure conditions of stability throughout Korea. Coast, the 8th Army took Pyongyang on the 19th of October, the only time the West ever held the communist capital. Syngman Rhee addressed the crowds from the balcony where his opponent had once stood. All Korea now seemed in his grasp. Among the UN forces, thoughts were turning to home. Their work in Korea seemed finished. Some troops were already preparing to leave. But a week after the fall of Pyongyang, everything was to change. The Chinese entered the war. They poured out of the hills, hitting the UN columns in massive human waves. On the battlefield, surprise was total. Yet the UN intelligence services had consistently discounted the obvious danger of Chinese intervention. Mao Zedong's hold on China after the Civil War was barely secure in 1950. American military and political support for his opponent, Chiang Kai-shek, and the nationalist forces on Formosa was a constant threat. The presence of American forces along the Korean-Chinese border could make his position untenable. As soon as the Americans crossed the 38th parallel, Mao ordered his armies to act. Chinese films portray the preparation of a volunteer army going to the aid of North Korea. In reality, 200,000 men of the battle-hardened Red Army made their way across the Yalu River into the mountains of North Korea. Traveling light, without radio communications, they hit the UN forces without warning. Yet after 2 days, they disengaged, just as suddenly melting back into the mountains. They left captured prisoners as the only proof of their involvement, and the UN assumed the threat was gone. Nevertheless, MacArthur ordered the Air Force to create a wasteland of the entire area between the front line and the Yalu River, not only to destroy supply lines or enemy concentrations, but as a deliberate punitive demonstration of the sheer power the Allies possessed in the air. They attacked every factory, every city, and every village with incendiary bombs and napalm. But suddenly they were attacked themselves. The arrival of the first MiG-15 jets in November astounded Western pilots. That the communists had developed a jet, and one that actually outmaneuvered their own F-80 Shooting Stars in the first jet-powered dogfights, was a profound shock. It was not until the arrival of the F-86 Sabre that they were able to redress the balance in MiG Alley, despite being forbidden to pursue the MiGs to their Chinese bases. The Sabre was to be the principal fighter for the rest of the war, operated by a new generation of highly skilled pilots. The new jet aces became folk heroes in the United States as they vied for the record number of kills. On the ground, MacArthur attacked again on the 24th of November, still confident of taking all Korea by Christmas. For 2 days, his forces pushed northwards towards the Yalu River. Then the Chinese came out of the hills again, and this time they weren't going back. The UN had pushed deeper into communist-held territory, and when the Chinese attacked, it was from the flanks and behind, as well as at the head of the columns. The 8th Army in the west was once again taken totally by surprise, and whole sections of the line simply panicked and collapsed. They lost 11,000 men in the first few days. Many were marched off to face the dreadful privations of North Korean and Chinese prison camps. It became known as the Big Bug-Out, the worst American military defeat for a century. A whole army disengaged, joining the thousands of refugees jamming the road south. And once it started, it couldn't be stopped. They abandoned Pyongyang in the headlong rush south, leaving it burning in their wake. But for 10 Corps in the eastern mountains, there was nowhere to run. One of the hardest battles of the war was fought by the 20,000 Marines surrounded beside the Chosin Reservoir, where the temperatures fell to -30 below. The advance guard pushing onto the Yalu River had been decimated. The few survivors who had fought their way back to the base of the reservoir were evacuated from the airstrip, wounded or frostbitten or both. The rest were faced with the long fight back to the coast through 6 Chinese divisions, in conditions which made mere survival a struggle. They still took their heavy equipment, and as always, their dead with them. Airdrops were their lifeline. Whole bridge sections had to be dropped at one point, to cross a gorge south of Koto Ri, which threatened to end the epic march there. "We're not retreating," said the Marines commander. "We're advancing in a different direction." That advance continued along 20 miles of mountain road. The Chinese continually worked their way in to harry the column. For them too, the road from Chosin caused incredible suffering. Under constant threat from the air, they couldn't even light fires for fear of bringing down a hail of bombs on their position. And frostbite accounted for many of their losses. On the 10th of December, 10 Corps finally marched into the port of Hungnam and prepared for evacuation south. Some thought they could have held a perimeter around their biggest base in the north, but the will to take risks had gone. The volume of supplies was too great to move, and Hungnam turned into a vision of hell as Koreans fought in the streets for precious foodstocks. An orgy of destruction followed as engineers destroyed anything of use to the Chinese. And the departing fleet vented its frustration by shelling the city in a final embittered flourish before turning south to Busan, leaving the civilian population to fend for themselves. To the north once more. South of Wonju, the 8th Army dug in and finally held the line. Whether through their efforts or because the Chinese supply line had reached its limit, the southward drive stopped. Ridgway now worked a remarkable transformation on his force. Within weeks of his appointment, the attitude among his men had changed. And he changed the tactics too, deciding to maximize the UN's chief advantage, sheer firepower. They called it the meat grinder. Chinese columns were broken up at long range by artillery and air action on an unprecedented scale. And it worked. In January, they began steadily grinding their way north for the second time. Ridgway ordered them always to move in sufficient strength to provide all-round defense, allowing their artillery and air support to beat a path for them. There was to be no repeat of the first headlong dash north, where the narrow road-bound columns had been encircled or infiltrated with ease. Now they moved in strength across country as well, paying renewed attention to key features in the terrain, ready to hold the high ground if counterattacked, and their confidence grew with each victory. At one point, their advance and the spring thaw revealed the fate of some of their comrades, either ambushed by guerrillas or overtaken by the north in the winter retreat. Roped hands and feet revealed they'd been killed after capture. Just one more atrocity in a particularly savage war. By April, they were across the 38th parallel once again. Seoul had changed hands for the 4th time in 1 year. As they consolidated their hold on the south, a political and military debate broke out over the next objective. Faced with the rising cost in UN lives, President Truman decided that widening the war would be unsustainable politically. Both sides now needed and wanted a ceasefire. Hopes of peace were high, and at first it seemed tantalizingly close. But there would be frequent breakdowns. The talking and the fighting dragged on at enormous cost in lives for over 2 more years. At the front it was stalemate. Both sides had dug in, and the only aim was to bludgeon a response from the opposite negotiating team. Chinese still attacked in human waves, apparently heedless of the losses they suffered from the merciless UN firepower. They fought for each hill, seeking the slightest strategic advantage. Field hospitals and helicopters improved the chances of survival, but the casualty figures grew. Previously unknown and unremarkable hills became infamous over the next 2 years, as battles raged over their pitted slopes. White Horse Hill, Old Baldy, Pork Chop Hill were lost, won back, and then given up as the line on the negotiating table was straightened or otherwise altered. The talks had moved to Panmunjom, where the latest stumbling block was the repatriation of prisoners of war. The UN claimed that many of the Chinese wanted to join the nationalists on Formosa. The Chinese argued that they should all be returned, and a propaganda battle ensued. Within the camps, communist and anti-communist groups organized and intimidated each other. When communist prisoners took control of Kojido prison camp, tanks and flamethrowers were called in to retake it. The evident force used to suppress the revolt shocked many. Talks faltered again, with the UN slipping behind in the propaganda war. For over a year, sustained air attacks attempted to cut supplies to the Chinese front line. Three-quarters of the Air Force and all the carrier planes were dedicated to Operation Strangle. Yet it still failed to stop all movement of supplies. Northern labour gangs constantly repaired and replaced road and rail links, almost as fast as they were hit. And though they flattened whole cities, the communists simply moved their factories underground, where they continued to turn out the weapons required at the front. Despite statistical claims to the contrary, the air campaign failed to achieve its stated aims in Korea, just as it would again in Vietnam. At the front, the routine continued. Thousands of tons of ordnance delivered a few miles away, with all the calculation and geometrical precision of the production line. The exchange of sick and wounded prisoners in March 1953 was the first movement towards a ceasefire. With the UN as a belligerent, a commission of neutral nations was required to oversee the peace process. Finally, on the 27th of July 1953, General William Harrison led the UN delegation into Panmunjom. Without a word or a sign to each other, he and the North Korean General Nam Il signed the armistice agreement. There was no South Korean signature on the document, as Syngman Rhee still refused to accept the existence of the dividing line in Korea, which after 3 years and millions of lives had come to rest almost where it started, near the 38th parallel. Today, the two sides still watch each other warily across the same blood-soaked strip of land that separates the two Koreas.